The US has indicated that in their absence from the G20 Summit in Johannesburg, they'd prefer that no G20 Leaders declaration is adopted. The G20 Sous-Sherpa Ambassador Xolisa Mabhongo told Full View that communication in this regard was received from the US this weekend. South Africa will hand the G20 presidency over to the US.
The only country that is not in the room is the United States. And of course, that is also their choice not to be in the room. So far, we do not foresee any major challenges. We did receive over the weekend communication from the United States where they indicated that in their absence in the meeting, their preference is that there should be no declaration adopted. However, as the presidency of the G20, this does not depend on us. We are the president, but the G20 is made up of 19 countries plus the European Union and the African Union. So as the presidency, therefore, we are guided by the views of all G20 members. So you cannot, no country can just make an appeal to the president and say, I'm not in your meeting, so don't have a declaration. But we have not really had any challenges with that in the meeting that started yesterday.
Let's unpack this now with Dr. Sthembile Mbete, the Executive Director of the Public Affairs Research Institute. Dr. Mbete, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. This is an interesting moment in that multilateralism is facing its first crisis of consensus, it seems. Maybe not its first, but certainly one that involves South Africa at a grand scale. Talk to us about what the implication of this could potentially be on the G20 declaration.
Well, I think we must be a bit cautious in those kinds of grand statements. I mean, multilateralism has faced many crises of consensus over the last year in particular. We've seen how the UN systems have basically collapsed because of the United States' intransigence. And we've seen that happen in the United Nations Security Council in particular several times over the last decade. So I think that this isn't a particularly unique crisis in multilateralism. It is, however, a very big crisis, I think, for the G20 itself. So the G20, unlike the United Nations, unlike the World Bank, for example, or the IMF, is a club. It's an informal international it's not an organization as such. It's a club of members, the 19 states and then the African Union and the European Union. And it works on an informal set of rules. And one of those rules is that decisions are taken by consensus. And so at the end of each year of the G20 at the Leaders Summit, that there's a Leaders Declaration, and that Leaders Declaration is adopted by all the leaders that are in the room, and then it is communicated to the public. And within that declaration, it's a consolidation of all the decisions that have been made by all the different working groups through all the different meetings that have taken place in a year. And even if countries may disagree with some of the decisions that have been taken over the course of the year, the understanding is that they'll come to a common agreement and they will communicate this declaration that they all just generally agree with most of it, even though none of the decisions of the G20 are binding. So no country is compelled or forced to implement everything that is said or spoken about in the declaration, but it's always been, since the summit meeting started in 2008, that at the end of a year of G20 meetings, there is this Leaders Declaration that reflects, at least outwardly, some kind of consensus amongst the G20 members. And this year is going to be the first year since the G20 Summit meeting started in 2008 that you're likely not to have that kind of Leaders Declaration, and instead will have a chair's statement, which is a statement by the president of the G20, in this case South Africa, that will then have all of the decisions that have been taken over the course of the year, but won't necessarily be backed by all the members of the G20, in this case including the United States and Argentina. It is, of course, completely possible for the countries of the G20 that will be here for the member states to pass a Leaders Declaration, with, say to the United States, well, and Argentina, you weren't in the room, and we're going to decide to make this Leaders Declaration anyway, but I think that's highly unlikely given the politics at the moment.
So the absence of the US is unimpactful? Is that a fair statement?
No, the absence of of the US is impactful because it does mean that the kind of processes that have always backed the G20 and enforced the G20's legitimacy are weakened, right, if you don't have the United States in the room. However, it doesn't mean that the decisions that have been made over the course of the year won't still be adopted in some form and that countries won't continue implementing those decisions. Remember also that the very important part of the G20 Leaders Summit is all the bilateral meetings and all the meetings that happen in the background between different countries, and the US not being around for those, I think, is a significant disadvantage for the US because decisions are going to be made without it being there.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Mbete, thank you so much for your time.